In this video, we are going to take a look at some of the bloodiest battles during World War II. We've listed some of the most significant here in no particular order. A startling reminder, if one were needed, the war can be hell. Number 1. The Battle for Moscow. On June 22, 1941, Hitler's armies invaded the Soviet Union. Almost a year later, Hitler told his ally, Finnish Field Marshal Mannerheim, about what the Germans had discovered about the Red Army. It is evident they have the most monstrous armament that is humanly conceivable. Hitler had experience with how well armed the Soviets were by late fall 1941. For the first months of the war, the Germans had a relatively easy time of it, advancing close to 100 miles in a day. Then, just before the Soviet counterattack on December 4th, German units reported they could see the towers of the Kremlin in the distance. That was as close as they ever got to the city. When spies told him that Japan would attack the US in the Pacific, Stalin ordered the transfer of Soviet Far East armies to Moscow. These troops were fresh and well equipped, especially for cold weather. Hitler believed the Soviets were nearly out of reserves, but on December 5th, the Red Army in Moscow came storming out of the snow at the Germans. 1.1 million Soviet soldiers, 58 divisions, and an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 tanks, over 7,500 guns, and nearly 1,000 aircraft sent the Germans reeling. A stubborn and skilled defense helped the Germans blunt the Soviet offensive, but this took weeks and cost the Germans somewhere between 175,000 and 250,000 men. The Soviets lost perhaps 600,000 men in defense and the counterattack. Stupefying numbers, not compared to losses sustained in our next battle. Number 2. Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad lasted from late August 1942 to early February 1943. Stalingrad, today called Volgograd, was an industrial city that lay in a narrow arc along the western bank of the Volga River. Knocking out Stalingrad's arms factories and cutting the Volga might damage the Soviet war effort so much that Stalin might surrender. Plus, the city was named after him, so Hitler taking the city would be highly symbolic. The German 6th Army drove across eastern Ukraine and southern Russia through late June and July. Finally, they reached the outskirts of Stalingrad in mid-August. German bombers preceded them and reduced the city to ruins, not realizing they were creating the perfect rubble-strewn urban defensive battlefield. The fighting in Stalingrad was brutal and many times hand-to-hand. And like they had been in front of Moscow, the Germans were a little underdressed for the weather. In other words, they started to freeze to death. By November the 19th, the Germans had taken most of the city except for one pocket on the river, to which Soviet reinforcements arrived. However, on the German flanks, the Soviets had gathered two massive army groups. Making things worse, those flanks were held by German allies Hungary and Romania, whose troops were under-equipped and had very low morale. On November the 19th, the Red Army attacked both flanks and soon surrounded the Germans inside the city. For the next 2 months, the Red Army would slowly push the Germans into a smaller and smaller circle. Finally, despite explicit orders not to, the Germans surrendered in late January. 90,000 Germans went into captivity. Only about 5,000 ever returned home. The Germans and their allies sustained 800,000 plus men killed, wounded, and missing. The Soviets lost even more, likely over 1 million men. But they could sustain the losses, and Hitler could not. Number 3. Monte Cassino. By late winter 1944, the Americans and British had invaded Italy and moved towards Rome. Some of the German soldiers deployed there to meet them were veterans who had been lucky enough to be evacuated from Stalingrad before its surrender. Some of those men fought in Italy, and a small number survived the war. What they said about our next battle may surprise you, but they said it was a harder fight than Stalingrad. The path to Rome, which lies on the western coast of Italy, was difficult. First, there is a narrow coastal plain, then mountains almost across the peninsula. The monastery atop Monte Cassino was in the mountains overlooking the main road to Rome. On the mountains and hills around the monastery, the Germans had built a series of defensive lines, which were zeroed in by machine guns, cannon and mortars, hundreds of them. As a result, the Germans could and did interrupt the advance on Rome. To deal with them, the Allies sent waves of troops up the hillsides in an international affair. Americans, English, Scots, Canadians, Poles, Indians, Berbers all had a go at pushing the Germans off the hills. The Allies charged, pushed, bombed, and shelled the positions around Monte Cassino for 4.5 months, but the Germans held. Eventually, the Allied superiority in manpower and arms drove the Germans out of the area, and the Allies took Rome on the day before D-Day in France. The Germans lost 55,000 men, and the Allies over 25,000. Number 4. The Battle of the Bulge. In May 1940, the Germans surprised the French by attacking through the Ardennes forest, a relatively unprotected part of the Franco-German border. The French believed the Ardennes to be impassable for tanks. They were wrong, and it cost the French their country. In December 1944, the Americans made the same mistake. Believing the Germans were almost through and unlikely to attack even if they weren't, the Americans sent new soldiers and units needing rest, resupply, and reinforcements to the Ardennes. The placement could not have been worse, for Hitler had planned a counter-offensive in that area. On December 16, 1944, some 400,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 armored vehicles slammed into less than half that number of Americans. Though the Germans made some stunning gains in the first couple of days, surprisingly stiff American resistance in places caused their advance to falter, most notably at the road hub town of Bastogne. Within 2 days, American reinforcements were on the way, and by Christmas, the balance of forces was about equal. By the end of the first week of January, the bad weather which had prevented Allied air power from being deployed cleared, and the Americans were back on the offensive, slowly pushing the Germans back into their homeland. The Battle of the Bulge was the costliest battle of the war for the US Army, with dead, wounded, and missing numbering nearly 90,000 in total. Number 5. Okinawa. The Battle of Okinawa was the last battle between the US and Japan. Beginning in May 1942 with the Battle of Midway, the Americans had been advancing inexorably towards the Japanese homelands. Okinawa was part of the Ryukyu chain of islands 900 miles south of Tokyo. It had been controlled or owned by Japan for centuries, and was a critical army and air base for the Japanese. From Okinawa, the Japanese could launch air attacks against American ships and in support of their troops in China. Any US invasion of Japan needed Okinawa as their staging area for the expected invasion of Japan. The battle began on April 1, 1945, and ended in late June. The US Army and Marines quickly took control of the southern part of the island, but the Japanese had fortified the north. The fighting there was brutal beyond belief. The Americans fighting to end the war and get their revenge for Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese fighting to prevent an invasion on their homeland. Flamethrowers, suicide charges, hand-to-hand combat, civilians used as human shields, and bombs by the Japanese, and most famously the kamikaze suicide pilots all combined to make Okinawa the bloodiest battle of the war in the Pacific. Number 6. Leningrad. Today known as St. Petersburg, Leningrad was the site of one of the greatest horrors of the war: mass starvation. Even before the Battle of Moscow had begun, the Germans had effectively cut off what many believe was and is one of the world's most beautiful cities. It's hard for most people today to comprehend the number of Soviet people, both soldiers and civilians, killed during World War II. 20 million. Yes, you heard that right. Moreover, 1 million of those who perished died in and around Leningrad from September 1941 to late January 1944, and those were just civilian deaths. In addition, over 520,000 Red Army soldiers were killed, captured, missing, presumed dead during the siege. For many reasons, the primary ones being the German siege, the weather, and the city's location, hunger set in relatively early in the battle. By the first winter, bread was being mixed with sawdust so the supply of flour would stretch, and people ate their pets. Worst of all, there were cases of cannibalism. These cases were rumored at the time, but it was only much later, in the 1980s, that the Soviet government acknowledged that corpses had been consumed and that some people had been killed for meat. Number 7. Berlin. By spring 1945, almost everyone on the planet, except Adolf Hitler and a few fanatics, knew that Germany was defeated. Still, Hitler's hold on the people and army was so strong that many continued to fight to the bitter end. The Germans had between 500 and 700,000 men under arms in and around Berlin. However, many were boys and old men, and wounded or exhausted soldiers. The number of competent fighting men was more likely less than 200,000. To meet that, the Soviets amassed an astounding 2 million men, more than 6,000 tanks, nearly 8,000 planes, and over 40,000 artillery pieces. Berlin was surrounded by late April, and it's estimated that there was a Soviet gun every 30 meters around the city. Those guns began their attack on Berlin on Hitler's birthday, April 20th. Not a coincidence. The Battle of Berlin did not last as long as Stalingrad. However, for a short time, the fighting was just as intense, or more so. The civilians of Berlin were caught in the middle of both the fighting and the mass atrocities. SS troops began to go wild, killing anyone suspected of being defeatist, and Soviet troops began to exact terrible revenge. The city was already in ruins from the bombing attacks of the Western Allies. The Soviet ground attack flattened much of those buildings that remained. More than 100,000 Soviets were killed in the attack, and 250,000 were wounded. German casualties were about the same. One of those casualties was Adolf Hitler, who killed himself on April 30th. Shortly after, Germany surrendered, and World War II in Europe was over. We hope you enjoyed our video. Please leave a comment down below about your thoughts, and don't forget to like it. Subscribe to the channel as an offering to the gods of the algorithm, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.